The beach at Pelican Cove looked the way it always did at 9 in the morning. White sand, blue water, the smell of sunscreen and salt carried on warm air. Families, laughter, a lifeguard settling into his tower with a coffee cup. Nobody noticed the boy with the black plastic bag walking the waterline, picking up crushed cans. Nobody ever did. Then the screaming started. Within 30 seconds, a circle had formed near the water's edge. A man in an expensive suit on his knees in the sand. A police officer pushing through the crowd. A woman in a pink hat shouting into her phone. And in the center, a black boy in a faded gray hoodie arms, reaching toward a baby lying still on the hot sand, being grabbed by the shoulder and yanked back. Someone stop that kid. He's making it worse. He didn't look up. He only looked at the baby, at the lips slowly turning blue. What do you do when the only person who knows how to save a life is the one everyone is trying to stop? Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I read every single one. And if you're new here, this is the kind of story that stays with you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 5:14 in the morning. Darius Cole opened his eyes before his mind did. That was how it worked under the boardwalk. The body learned to wake before the sounds got too close. Footsteps on the planks above. A seagull landing on something nearby. The low hum of a refrigeration truck making early deliveries to the restaurants on Shore Drive. He sat up slowly. His right hand pressed into the cardboard beneath him, and he felt at the thin layer of salt crystals that had settled overnight. He ran his thumb across them. Cold. Rough. That was the first thing every morning. The salt. It coated everything down here. His hoodie, the edges of his book, the creases of his palms. After 8 months at Pelican Cove, he had stopped noticing the smell. Now it was just the smell of waking up. He was 13 years old and this was home. The space between column 7 and column 8 of the section 7 boardwalk was 12 feet wide and just tall enough to sit upright in without hitting your head. Darius had measured it on his first week. He had also measured that the angle of the columns blocked the wind from the northeast, that the sand stayed driest closest to the third column from the left, and that the maintenance crew never came this far down on Tuesdays or Fridays. Details like that mattered when you had nowhere else to go. He pulled his backpack from behind the column and went through it the way he always did, not searching for anything specific, just confirming everything was still there. A half-empty water bottle, a folded rain poncho, the color of a manila envelope, a library card 3 months expired, a granola bar wrapper he kept meaning to throw away, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to keep the edges from getting soft, the book. Wilderness Medicine and Beach Rescue Handbook. The cover was warped and the spine had cracked somewhere in the middle. He had found it 8 months ago in the trash bin beside the old lifeguard station at the north end of the beach, the one that had been shut down after the budget cuts. Someone had thrown it away like it had no more use. He carried it like it was the only thing that did. He had read page 247 11 times. He pulled on his hoodie gray once, now the color of old dishwater, and his Converse sneakers, both white once, both yellowed at the soles from months of salt and sand. The left shoe was a half size too small. He had learned to walk in a way that didn't make it obvious. At the public water faucet at the end of the boardwalk, he filled his bottle and drank slowly, watching the sky go from black to gray to the pale, uncertain color it turned just before sunrise. He thought about his mother the way he always did at this hour, not a memory exactly, more like a shape in the light. She had been gone 4 years. A car accident on the Route 1 bridge in the rain when Darius was 9. He didn't think about the bridge anymore. He thought about what she said once standing at the window of their apartment in Raleigh, looking out at nothing in particular. "Someday, baby. We'll go somewhere with water as far as you can see." He had taken a Greyhound bus to Pelican Cove on a Tuesday in October with $12 in a duffel bag. Not because he had a plan, because the ticket was the cheapest one that ended somewhere near the ocean, and his mother had said water as far as you can see, and he wanted to at least see if she was right. She was. 5 foster homes in 4 years had taught Darius one thing above everything else: never unpack the whole bag. Not because he was difficult, not because he didn't try, but because he had learned through 5 different living rooms, 5 different sets of rules, 5 different faces that eventually stopped looking at him with patience. that the kindness offered to a foster child was often the kind with an expiration date. The last family had been in Greensboro. They hadn't said goodbye. They had just left an envelope on the kitchen table with his name on it, and inside was a bus ticket and $60, and a note that said, "We're sorry things have changed." He was 12. He had taken the money, left the note, and walked to the station. He didn't blame them anymore. Blame took energy he didn't have. By 8 in the morning, the beach had begun to fill. Darius moved through it the way he always did, slowly staying close to the waterline black plastic bag in one hand, eyes down. He collected crushed cans along the way, 12 cents each at the recycling center on Market Street. On a good day, he could find enough for a meal. On a bad day, he found enough to remember that tomorrow might be better. Before the beach woke up fully, he always stopped at the same spot on the boardwalk railing and read. 30 minutes, sometimes 40. He read because it was the one thing nobody could take back from him. Every page was a place he had been. Every chapter was evidence that he was still moving, still going somewhere, even when he was standing still. He passed the row of private beach access gates, Shore Drive, residents-only signs in navy and gold. He passed the umbrella rental station. He passed the spot where 3 weeks ago, a tourist had dropped a $20 bill, and it had blown into the water before either of them could reach it. He still thought about that bill sometimes. There was a nurse at the first aid station at the entrance to the boardwalk named Carmen Webb. She was the only person on this beach who used his name. Most mornings, she left something outside the station door. Before her shift started, a granola bar, a bottle of juice, once a rain jacket, 2 sizes too big that he still wore. That morning, he had found a note folded under a sandwich bag. "Eat something real today, okay?" He had read it twice before he picked up the food. He was almost to the north end when he saw them. A man in a dark blazer, too formal for a beach morning, sitting in a low chair beneath a canvas shade umbrella laptop, balanced on his knees, phone pressed between his ear and his shoulder. And a few feet away at the very edge of the wet sand where small waves came and went, a baby sat strapped into a stroller with mesh sides. 10 months old maybe, round-faced, laughing at something only babies understood, a wave, a bubble, a particular quality of morning light. Darius watched him for a moment. A child that happy deserved to stay that way. He moved on. It was 9:14 a.m. when he crouched down near the water's edge to pick up a flattened Sprite can. He heard the stroller wheels, first a hollow scrape across wet sand, then the silence where a baby's laugh had been, then the scream. He stood up. The circle had formed the way crowds always did around something terrible fast, and with no one meaning to make it worse. Darius pushed through the outer edge, using his shoulder to create space between people who were too busy watching to notice they were in the way. He came through the last gap and stopped. Lucas was on the sand. The stroller lay on its side 3 feet away, one wheel still spinning slowly. The baby was on his back and wrapped around his left wrist, pink, translucent. Glistening in the morning light was the tentacle of a Portuguese man-o'-war. 6 inches of it, maybe more. The float had already washed back with the tide. Only the tentacle remained coiled at the wrist, like something deliberate. Lucas was crying, but weakly. The sound was wrong. Too thin. His face was flushed, and his breathing had the shallow, uneven quality that Darius had read about but never heard in person. Raymond Whitfield was on his knees in the wet sand, both hands hovering over his son without touching him. The look on his face, the specific look of a person who has never once in his life not known what to do. Then the crowd shifted and Dr. Greg Paulson stepped through. He was 50, maybe 52, broad-shouldered, wearing a polo shirt the pale blue of a hospital corridor. He carried himself the way certain men did, not loudly, but with a settled certainty that the space around them was meant to accommodate. He crouched beside Lucas and looked at the tentacle with a professional calm that made the people nearest him exhale. "I'm a doctor," he said loud enough for the circle to hear. "Everyone stand back." Raymond looked up. "What do we do? It needs to come off, right now." Paulson reached down with his bare right hand and gripped the tentacle near the wrist. "Are you sure that's—" Raymond started. "Trust me." Paulson pulled. Lucas screamed, a real scream this time, high and ragged, and then went quiet in a way that was worse than the screaming. Darius saw it happen. Watched the pneumatocyst still attached to the tentacle discharge, on contact with Paulson's pulling motion. Watch Lucas's face go from flushed to pale in under 10 seconds. He had read about this. He had read about exactly this. Paulson took a Sprite bottle someone handed him from the crowd and poured it over the wrist. The carbonated sugar water hit the remaining nematocysts like a signal. Darius was already moving. "Stop!" He put his hand on Paulson's arm. The Sprite made it worse. Paulson turned and looked at him the way people looked at something they hadn't expected to find standing next to them. He took in the hoodie, the plastic bag, the shoes, the age. "Son, I have 30 years of clinical experience. He needs salt water, not that." Darius kept his voice flat, and even the way he had taught himself to speak when he needed to be heard. "Look at his lips." Paulson looked. The color was changing, the pale pink draining towards something closer to gray-blue at the edges. "Security. Someone get security." Officer Dale Pruitt had been working his way through the crowd from the south end of the beach. He was there in 15 seconds, hand already extended toward Darius's shoulder, before he had a full picture of what was happening. "Okay, kid, step away from the baby. He's going into anaphylactic shock." Darius didn't move. "You have maybe 2 minutes before his airway swells shut." "I'm not going to say it again." Darius turned and looked at him directly. "Then don't, and watch him die while you didn't say it." Pruitt's hand closed on his shoulder. Darius let it close. He wasn't going to fight a police officer, but he didn't step back. Then from somewhere in the outer ring of the crowd, a woman's voice cut through clearly. "Someone get him away from that baby. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's making everything worse." Linda Marsh was 40, standing 6 people back, with her phone raised recording. She had arrived 3 minutes into it and had no information beyond what she could see. A black teenager in dirty clothes standing over a sick infant with a police officer's hand on his shoulder. She had drawn a conclusion that felt to her completely obvious. The crowd shifted. A few people began to move inward. Someone else said the doctor already said step back. The circle tightened. Raymond Whitfield stood up. He stood slowly, and when he was fully upright, he placed himself between Darius and the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. "Nobody touches this boy." "Sir, he's just a—" Pruitt began. "He's the only one here who said the right thing." Raymond didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the circle of faces. "Give him room." Nobody moved for a moment. Then one by one, they gave it. Darius was already crouching back down beside Lucas. He looked at a small boy nearby who was holding a yellow sand pail half full of seawater. He held out his hand. "Can I use that?" The boy looked at his mother. She nodded. The boy handed it over. Darius poured the seawater over Lucas's wrist in a slow, controlled stream, naturally the right salinity, exactly what page 247 had said. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the expired library card. He pressed the edge flat against the skin and moved it in one direction along the tentacle, not pulling, not pressing hard, just guiding the remaining nematocysts away without triggering them. He worked for 40 seconds. He didn't rush. Then Lucas stopped crying. Not the stop that meant calm. The other kind. Darius set down the card. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of Lucas's neck and counted. The pulse was there, but faint, fluttering, the rhythm of something trying to stay present against significant resistance. Anaphylactic shock. Airway compromised. He knew the sequence. He repositioned. Lucas carefully tilted the chin up, slightly placed the heel of one hand on the center of the tiny chest and began. 30 compressions measured, and even then he sealed his mouth over both the baby's mouth and nose together and gave 2 small puffs. Not breaths, puffs, because the lungs were small and the pressure needed to be gentle and returned to compressions without pause. 110 beats per minute. He didn't count aloud. He had counted so many times in his head under the boardwalk that his body already knew the pace. Paulson was standing 8 feet away. He had not spoken since Raymond stood up. Linda Marsh had lowered her phone. Pruitt stood at the edge of the cleared space with his hat in his hands. From somewhere down Shore Drive, very far away, came the sound of a siren. Darius did not look up. He did not change his rhythm. The siren meant 3 minutes at least, maybe 4. And Lucas had not coughed and had not moved and had not made a sound. And the morning sun was climbing, and the sand beneath his knees was hot, and he kept going. He kept going. The siren got louder and then stayed the same volume for a long time, which meant it was close, but traffic was slowing it down. Darius knew the sound of a siren that wasn't going to arrive in time. He had heard it before in a different city, in a different year, and he had learned that the only answer to that sound was to not wait for it. He kept going. The sand was hot against his knees and the sun was directly in his eyes now, and his arms had begun to ache from the shoulder down, but the rhythm didn't change. 30 compressions, 2 puffs, 30 compressions. He counted in his head, but not with numbers, with the beat itself, the way a song stays in your body after you've heard it enough times that you no longer need to remember it consciously. Raymond Whitfield had not moved from his position 3 feet away. He was sitting back on his heels now watching, and the expression on his face had passed through fear and grief and confusion, and arrived somewhere beyond all three, a kind of suspended terrible attention. He watched Darius's hands. He watched his son's chest. The crowd had gone quiet in the particular way that crowds went quiet when they no longer knew what to want. Minute 2. Lucas still hadn't moved. Darius adjusted his angle slightly, shifted his weight forward, gave himself more leverage on the compressions without increasing the force. His brain was running 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was the rhythm. The second was a quiet, methodical inventory of what he knew and what he had done, and whether there was anything he had missed. He had addressed the tentacle correctly. He had used salt water. He had not wasted time. He had started compressions within 40 seconds of Lucas losing consciousness. The math was right. The technique was right. Sometimes right wasn't enough. He knew that too, but he did not stop. Minute 3. The siren was close now. Close enough to hear it separate from itself, the Doppler pitch falling as the vehicle turned onto Shore Drive. Darius heard someone in the crowd say, they're here, and felt the shift in energy around him, that collective exhale that happened when people decided someone else would take over. He didn't exhale. He kept the rhythm. Then he adjusted the seal on the next breath, tilted the angle of the chin, 1 degree further, gave the smallest puff, and felt rather than heard something change. Lucas coughed. It was almost nothing. A reflex, small and involuntary, the sound of a body remembering something it had briefly forgotten how to do. But it was there. It was real. It was the thin, reedy first note of an airway opening. Darius held still for exactly 1 second. Then he moved Lucas into the recovery position on his side chin, forward airway clear, and kept his hand on the small chest. Lucas coughed again, longer this time. A sound came with it, not quite a cry, but the beginning of one. The paramedics came through the crowd with the stretcher at a run and slowed when they saw what they were running toward: a boy in a gray hoodie crouched over an infant in the recovery position, hands still on the chest, no panic in the posture at all. The first paramedic dropped to one knee across from Darius. Who did the CPR? A beat of silence, the kind that lasted longer than it should have. Raymond looked at Darius. He did. The paramedic looked at Darius, the hoodie, the library card still on the sand, the yellow pail tipped over beside him, and then at the way Lucas was positioned and the color returning slowly to his face and the chest moving on its own. Good technique, she said. Keep him on his side until we get the stretcher under him. Darius nodded and didn't move his hand. They loaded Lucas in 90 seconds. Raymond stood to follow and then stopped, turned back. Darius was still on his knees in the sand, hands on his thighs, now watching the stretcher. Come with us. I'm fine. Darius said it the way he said most things, not as an argument, just as information. I'm not asking. Raymond's voice had none of the authority it probably carried in boardrooms and on phone calls. It was quieter than that, like something that had been worn down to its actual shape. Come with us. Darius looked up at him. In the full morning light, Raymond Whitfield looked older than he had on the beach chair. His blazer had sand on both knees and a wet mark along one sleeve. His eyes were red at the edges. Why? Darius asked. Raymond looked at his son being lifted into the ambulance. Then he looked back at Darius. Because I need to know the name of the person who just saved my son's life. Darius stood slowly. His knees were stiff. Darius Cole. At the ambulance door, Raymond stopped once more. Why did you step in? You didn't have to. Darius was quiet for a moment. He looked at Lucas on the stretcher, eyes closed, chest moving steadily, the color of his lips returning to something close to normal. He looked down at the floor of the ambulance when he answered, and his voice was low enough that Raymond had to lean in to hear it over the sound of the engine turning over. I just didn't want him to disappear. Raymond didn't say anything for a long time after that. In the ambulance, Darius sat in the rear corner on a jump seat and watched the paramedic work without being in the way. The vehicle was cold, the kind of climate control that cost money to maintain, and for a few minutes he simply sat with that. Cool air, a seat with a back, no one telling him to leave. He wasn't sure what to do with those three things at once, so he did nothing, which felt like the right answer. At Pelican Cove General, the attending physician in the pediatric emergency unit confirmed what Darius had already known from the numbers. Portuguese man o' war, severe allergic response, anaphylaxis, progressing toward cardiovascular collapse, CPR technique appropriate, use of seawater consistent with current clinical guidelines for cyanidarian envenomation, tentacle removal without bare hand contact, correct? Avoidance of fresh water or carbonated liquid, correct? The physician paused when she got to that part and looked at Raymond. Another 90 seconds and we would be having a different conversation, she said. Raymond nodded slowly. He had both hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't look at the physician when he nodded. He looked at Darius, who was sitting in a plastic chair outside the room with a paper cup of water he hadn't drunk yet. Nurse Carmen Webb passed through the corridor and saw him. She stopped, looked at the wet sand still on his shoes, the dry salt on his collar, the untouched cup. She went back to the nurse's station and returned 2 minutes later with a covered hospital tray. She set it on the chair beside him without asking. Eat something real, she said quietly. The same words as the note that morning. He looked up at her. She squeezed his shoulder once briefly and moved on. He ate slowly, each thing on the tray in order, as if rushing might make it disappear. He was most of the way through it when Raymond came back out of the room and stood in the corridor for a moment looking at the floor. Then he walked over and sat down in the chair on Darius's other side. Neither of them said anything right away. They sat with the hospital sounds around them, carts, monitors, the soft percussion of a building that never stopped, and the light through the corridor window moved from white to pale gold as the morning continued without them. Raymond asked about family the same way the hospital corridor asked for quiet, not demanding, just creating a space where something might come forward on its own. Darius answered in the fewest words that were still true. Mother gone, foster care done, Greensboro, then the bus station, then here. He left out the Foster families by name. He left out the note on the kitchen table. He left out the $60. Raymond listened to all of it, including the parts Darius didn't say. You're not going back to the beach tonight, he said when Darius was finished. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an offer, and it wasn't pity. It was the same tone as, come with us in the ambulance doorway, something reduced to its plainest form, and left there for Darius to pick up or leave. Darius picked it up. The guest room in the Shore Drive house was on the second floor, and the window looked directly out at the ocean. Darius stood at it for a long time after Raymond showed him the room and left him alone. The sun had set, but there was still light on the water, a deep orange-gray that moved in bands toward the horizon. He had watched this light before from below, from the angle of someone who lived underneath the city. It looked different from a window. It looked like something you were allowed to receive. The sheets were white and smelled faintly of lavender. The pillow was soft in the specific way that pillows were soft when they had never been slept on by someone with nowhere else to be. He turned off the lamp and lay down and pulled the blanket to his chin and positioned himself against the wall the same way he slept under the boardwalk, where you kept the solid thing behind you and watched the open space ahead. He did not sleep for a long time. Under the bed was his backpack. He had not unpacked it. The zippers were open, which was new. They were usually closed tight, ready for fast departure. He had not noticed himself opening them. He slept eventually to the sound of the ocean through the cracked window, and he woke twice in the night at sounds that turned out to be the house settling, and both times he lay still, with his hand flat on the floor, until the quiet came back. Lucas came home from the hospital 4 days later. In the weeks that followed, no one used the word staying. No one established rules or checked in formally or made announcements. Darius simply continued to be present, and the house continued to accommodate him, and after a while the two facts together began to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a condition of the place itself. Lucas was calmer when Darius was nearby. This was not sentiment, it was observable the way temperature was observable. The pediatric nurse who came 3 times a week noted it in her charts without elaboration. When Darius sat in the low chair beside the portable crib and talked, Lucas's breathing steadied. When he left the room for more than 20 minutes, the restlessness returned. Darius talked to him about everything he knew, about the stars as they looked from Section 7 of the boardwalk, where the restaurant lights didn't reach, and on clear nights you could see more sky than most people in Pelican Cove had ever noticed. About the sound the ocean made at 3 in the morning when the wind came from the southwest, a lower register than people expected, almost like breathing. About his mother's voice, which he described carefully because he was afraid of losing the specific quality of it if he stopped putting it into words. Lucas watched his face while he talked. He could not understand the words, but he understood the rhythm and the warmth, and he held on to it the way small children held on to anything that felt steady. Raymond watched from the kitchen doorway sometimes. He never came in while Darius was talking. He stood at the edge and observed the way a person observes something they had not yet found language for. School started the second week of September. Pelican Cove Middle School was 4 blocks from Shore Drive, a low brick building with a parking lot that flooded when it rained. Darius went on the first day with his backpack over one shoulder and took a seat in the second to last row of his science class close to the door. He kept the backpack on his lap for the first 3 days. Not deliberately, it was just where his hands went when he sat down. His teacher, Ms. Okafor, had been at Pelican Cove Middle for 11 years and had developed the specific patience of someone who had seen most things. She noticed the backpack and did not comment. On the 4th day, she put a problem on the board from the 10th grade advanced biology curriculum. A discussion starter, she said, not an assignment. Darius looked at it for 30 seconds, raised his hand and walked her through the answer in 4 steps, connecting it to a principle 2 chapters ahead in the textbook she hadn't assigned yet. The class was quiet when he finished. Miss Okafor looked at the board, then at him. She didn't applaud. She wrote 2 follow-up questions. He answered both correctly. She wrote his name in her grade book with a small notation beside it and moved the class forward. She stayed late that afternoon and pulled the district's advanced placement guidelines. He was not aware of any of this. What he was aware of was the night 2 weeks later when Lucas ran a fever of 102 and would not stop crying regardless of what the medicine did or didn't do. Raymond sat with him for an hour. Neither the nurse's suggestions nor the cool cloth helped. Darius heard it from the guest room. He waited 15 minutes in case it resolved on its own. Then he got up, went down the hall, knocked once and came in. He sat in the low chair and began talking in the same low, even voice. The stars, the ocean at 3 in the morning, his mother's voice described in particular detail because he was feeling the distance of it, and talking about it helped. Lucas was asleep in 8 minutes. Raymond stood at the door with the cool cloth still in his hand and said nothing for a long time. That night, passing the guest room, Raymond saw the door slightly open. He didn't mean to look in. He saw the shape of Darius asleep against the wall blanket to the chin. He saw the backpack under the bed. The zippers were still open. He stood there a moment, then continued to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, thinking about what it meant to be a child who had learned to always be ready to leave. In the morning, he came downstairs at 6:40 to find Darius already at the kitchen table with a glass of water reading. Not because he had been invited, not because he had been asked, just because. 3 weeks after the morning on the beach, the independent review was complete. It had been initiated quietly without press releases or announcements by the legal team Raymond retained the day after Lucas was discharged. The subject was simple: what had happened on the sand, in what order, and whether the interventions performed by each party were consistent with current clinical standards. The video Linda Marsh had posted, intending it as a warning, a record of a reckless teenager interfering with a medical emergency, had been downloaded and archived by 11 different accounts before she deleted it 40 minutes after posting. By the time the review team requested it, copies existed in 4 states. It turned out to be the most complete visual documentation of the entire sequence. Every hand, every decision, every second. The report was 14 pages. Raymond read all of it. The relevant conclusions: removal of cnidarian tentacle via bare hand traction, contraindicated. Application of fresh or carbonated water to envenomation site contraindicated. Use of seawater irrigation followed by card-edge nematocyst removal, consistent with WHO and Wilderness Medical Society current guidelines. Infant CPR technique, rhythm and airway management appropriate for patient age and condition. Raymond arranged to meet Paulson at Pelican Cove General on a Tuesday morning. Darius was at school. He didn't tell Darius what was said in that meeting until later that evening, sitting on the back porch of the Shore Drive house, with the ocean dark and the lights from the fishing boats moving slowly in the distance. What Raymond said was this: Paulson had come into the room prepared for a legal conversation. He had brought his own counsel. He had sat across the table with his hands folded and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of someone who had already decided how much to give. Raymond had placed the review report on the table between them and let him read the relevant sections. Then he had asked one thing, not for an apology, not for a statement to the press, just for Paulson to say on the record in front of the chief of emergency medicine, who was also in the room, what the report had concluded. There was a long silence. Then Paulson said, "The boy's intervention was appropriate, given the circumstances." 6 words, not generous, not warm. Given the circumstances, doing some work at the end that Raymond did not miss. But the name the boy was in the room, in the building where medicine happened, said by a man who had tried to make him leave. Darius listened to this on the back porch and did not say anything for a while. "Okay," he said finally. Raymond nodded. "Okay." That was all either of them needed it to be. 4 years passed the way years did when something in a life had quietly shifted, not with announcement, but with accumulation. Lucas learned to walk, then to run, then to sprint directly toward the ocean, regardless of who was watching. Darius finished middle school and started high school. His backpack moved from under the bed to the closet. One day he noticed it was there and didn't think about what that meant. That was how he knew something had changed. He was 17 the afternoon the storm came in. It had been a good day, warm, clear, the kind of late summer afternoon that Pelican Cove did better than most places. Lucas was 4 now and running along the wet sand at the waterline, collecting things: shells, sea glass, a bottle cap that he presented to Darius with the gravity of a significant discovery. Darius turned it over in his fingers and told him it was rare. Lucas believed him completely. Then the sky changed. It happened the way Atlantic storms sometimes did in late August, fast, and without the gradual buildup that gave you time to prepare. The wind shifted and the temperature dropped several degrees in under a minute, and the smell arrived before the rain did. Salt and wet concrete, and something colder underneath, a smell that belonged to a specific hour of a specific kind of night that Darius had not let himself think about in years. The rain started as they were walking back toward the car. Within 90 seconds, it was heavy and cold, and the smell was everywhere, and Shore Drive was slick and gray, and somewhere in the transition from the beach to the sidewalk, Darius stopped moving. He was not sure when it happened exactly. One moment he was walking, and the next he was standing at the edge of the curb, with the rain coming down hard, and his breath not working right, and the street in front of him not quite resolving into something he could cross. The cold was wrong. It was the wrong cold. The cold of cardboard on sand at 3 in the morning. The cold of a night when the wind had shifted and there was nothing between him and the open water, and he had lain completely still and wondered in a quiet, practical way whether he would still be there when it stopped. He heard Raymond calling his name from somewhere behind him. He couldn't answer. Then something small pressed against his right hand. Lucas had slipped away from Raymond and crossed the distance between them in his rain boots, the ones with the small yellow fish on the sides. He was 4 years old and soaking wet, and he had wrapped both hands around Darius's right hand and was looking up at him with the total focus that small children sometimes brought to things they did not fully understand but knew mattered. "Breathe, Darius," he said. "Please breathe." The words were exact. Darius had never told him. He had simply heard them somewhere in the architecture of his first months alive, absorbed them the way children absorbed everything said over them when the people around them believed they were not listening. Darius went down to one knee in the rain. Lucas wrapped his arms around his neck and held on, and the rain came down, and Raymond stood a few feet away, with his hand not quite reaching out, giving it a moment understanding, without being told that some things needed to happen at their own pace. That night after Lucas was asleep, Darius sat across from Raymond at the kitchen table and said everything he had never said. All of it. The fear of being sent away when he was no longer useful. The feeling of not deserving a room with a window that looked at the ocean. The guilt of being the one who made it out of foster care off the streets into a house with a table and food on it when he could name other children from other living rooms who hadn't. Raymond listened until there was nothing left. Then he said, "You saw Lucas when a doctor with 30 years of experience had already made him worse. You didn't have a degree. You had a book someone threw away and the kind of attention that only comes from knowing what it means to be invisible. That is not nothing, Darius. That is everything." The adoption was finalized on a Thursday in November. The courtroom in the Pelican Cove Municipal Building had fluorescent lights and linoleum floors, and a clerk who mispronounced Darius's last name twice before getting it right. Lucas sat on Raymond's knee in the front row and clapped when the other people in the room clapped, not understanding why, only understanding that something good was happening. The paper was signed. The name was written. Darius Cole Whitfield. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, which was where he kept the things he intended to keep. The white coat was heavier than he expected. Not physically, it was standard issue cotton polyester blend, the same as every other coat on the rack. But Darius stood in the locker room of Pelican Cove Children's Medical Center on his first morning and held it for a moment before putting it on the way. You held something you'd been moving toward for a long time before you were certain it was real. He put it on, looked at the badge clipped to the breast pocket. Dr. Darius Cole Whitfield, Pediatric Emergency Medicine. He read it twice, then he went to work. He took night shifts by preference. Not because the days were worse, but because at night the hospital was quieter and the parents in the waiting room were more frightened, and the children in the beds had no energy left for pretending they were fine. He understood all three of those things. He had been all three of those things at various points in his life, and the understanding made him useful in ways that didn't appear in any training manual. He sat with parents. He explained things twice, if once wasn't enough. He talked to children who couldn't sleep about the stars, as they looked from the roof of the building on a clear night, about the sound the ocean made at 3 in the morning, about the way certain fears got smaller if you gave them a name instead of letting them stay large and unnamed in the dark. He did not leave rooms too quickly. Sometimes when a colleague moved on to the next patient before Darius was satisfied, he stayed. He had learned to trust the instinct of staying. Most of the time it was nothing. Occasionally it was everything. He had been practicing for 3 years when Lucas turned 17. They were sitting on the sand at Section 7 on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, a day off for both of them. The beach nearly empty, the boardwalk replaced and repainted, and carrying no visible trace of the boy who had slept beneath it. The ocean was calm. The light was the particular gold of early autumn when the season was turning, but hadn't committed yet. Lucas was quiet for a while, looking at the water. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" He said, "If you hadn't been there that morning." Darius considered the question the way he considered most things fully, without rushing toward an answer. "I think about the book I found in that trash can a lot more than I think about myself," he said. Lucas looked at him. "Why?" "Because whoever threw it away had no idea what they were throwing away." Darius picked up a piece of shell from the sand and turned it over. "Nobody ever does." Lucas thought about this. The ocean came in and went out. "I don't remember any of it," Lucas said. "The beach that morning. Any of it." "I know. Does that bother you?" Darius set the shell down. "No," he said. "You weren't supposed to remember it. You were supposed to be here." The Lucas Whitfield Foundation was incorporated the following spring. Raymond had proposed it 2 years earlier. Darius had said yes without needing to think about it, and then spent several months thinking carefully about what yes meant in practice. Which children, which criteria, what kind of support would last beyond a single scholarship check. The answer they arrived at together: full medical school scholarships and 4-year mentorship programs for young people from homeless backgrounds, foster care systems, and low-income coastal communities. No GPA minimums, no legacy considerations. The only requirement was a demonstrated specific documentable desire to learn medicine and do something with it. In the first year, they funded 7 students. In the third year, 34. By the fifth year, the foundation operated in 6 coastal states and had placed over 100 students into medical programs they would not otherwise have been able to access. Darius did not publicize these numbers. He knew them. He read the annual report every year in his office with the door closed. The first awards ceremony was held in September in a rented hall 2 blocks from the beach. Raymond stood at the podium and spoke for 11 minutes. Near the end, he paused and looked down at his notes and then set them aside. "The boy who saved my son told me something on the beach that morning," he said. "I asked him why he stepped in. I asked him why he didn't just walk away." He paused. "He said I just didn't want him to disappear. That is the entire mission of this foundation. Not to rescue, not to fix. Simply to refuse to look away." In the third row, wearing her white nursing uniform because she had come directly from a shift at Pelican Cove, General Nurse Carmen Webb pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. In her left hand, she held a small folded piece of paper, the same piece she had written on the morning of the jellyfish, the same 7 words kept in the same drawer for years. She had not told anyone she still had it. Some things were not for telling. The first scholarship recipient was called to the front of the room. Amara Jones was 14 years old. She was the daughter of a commercial fisherman from Harker's Island, 40 minutes south of Pelican Cove. She was wearing a navy dress that had belonged to her mother, slightly wide at the shoulders, hem taken up an inch. In her left coat pocket was a folded piece of paper she had carried for 3 weeks. The rejection letter from the third scholarship program that had declined her application. She was not sure why she had brought it. She had not been able to leave it behind. When her name was called, she did not stand immediately. She looked to her left and then her right, the instinct of someone who had learned that good things announced in her direction were usually meant for someone nearby. Then she stood and walked to the front of the room, and Darius was there. He crouched down so that his eyes were level with hers. She was looking at him carefully, the way children looked at adults they were trying to decide whether to trust. He said, "I just didn't want you to disappear." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way people nodded when they recognized something they had been waiting to hear without knowing they were waiting. When the ceremony ended and the room began to empty, Darius watched Amara walk out through the rear door toward the beach. He did not follow. He stood at the edge of the hall with his hands in the pockets of his coat and watched through the glass. She walked to the water's edge, stood there for a moment with the evening light on her face and the ocean pulling at the sand near her shoes. Then she reached into her coat pocket, took out the rejection letter, and held it for a moment. She let it go. The wind took it south toward the water, and it was gone before it hit the surface. Darius stayed where he was. The moment was hers. It had nothing to do with him anymore, which was exactly how it was supposed to be. He looked out at the ocean, the same water, the same salt, the same horizon he had watched from below the boardwalk on the first morning. He arrived with $12 in a duffel bag and a mother's voice in his head saying, "Water as far as you can see." She had been right. It went on forever. Think about where this story began. A boy on a piece of cardboard under a boardwalk, salt crystals on his fingertips at 5 in the morning, a book someone threw away, $12 and a bus ticket to the only place that felt like something his mother had once promised him. No one was looking for him. No one was expecting anything from him. By every measure the world uses to decide who matters and who doesn't, Darius Cole had already been counted and dismissed before he turned 14. And then one morning on a beach full of people with every advantage he didn't have, he was the only one who saw what was actually happening. Not because he was special, not because the universe had chosen him, but because he had spent years paying close attention to a world that paid no attention to him, and that kind of attention, it turns out, is exactly what saves lives. He was grabbed. He was yelled at. A doctor told him he was wrong. A police officer told him to step back. A stranger with a phone told the crowd he was making things worse. He kept going. That is the part of this story I want you to sit with tonight. Not the miracle. Not the scholarship. Not the foundation or the white coat or the name on the badge. Those things are real and they matter. But the part I can't stop thinking about is the 4 minutes on hot sand when every voice around him said stop and he didn't. Because he had already decided that this child was not going to disappear. So here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to actually think about it before you scroll past. Have you ever been Darius? Have you ever been the person who could see clearly what needed to happen and been told by someone with more authority, more credentials, more confidence that you were wrong? And did you stop or did you keep going? If you're willing to be honest, have you ever been someone in that crowd? Have you ever been so certain that the person in front of you didn't belong, didn't know, didn't matter, that you missed what they were actually doing? Both of those questions are worth living with for a while. If this story reached something in you, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which part stayed with you. Tell me if you've ever been the one they tried to stop. I read every single one. If you're new here, this is what we do. We tell the stories that don't make the front page, the ones that live in the spaces between what people notice and what they ignore. Subscribe so you're here for the next one, and share this one. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to be reminded that being invisible doesn't mean being wrong. It never did.
And that's where the story ends, but karma never sleeps. If that story hit the different, smash the like button and subscribe to the Black Karma story. We drop new story every week about justice, betrayal, and karma hitting by heart. And don't forget, ring the notification bell so you always first in line. Now, tell me in the comment, what would you have done in their shoe? I read every single reply. And now, see you in the next one. On Black Karma Stories, karma always wins.